wind tore through the rigging of Caleb Harlow's fishing boat, driving rain against his weathered face as he fought to steady the wheel. The sea roared in fury, tossing the old vessel like a toy. His son, Eli, clung to the railing, his wide eyes flickering with fear. Caleb gritted his teeth, his hands aching from the strain. He knew the ocean's cruelty well, but tonight it felt personal, as though it wanted to swallow them whole. Caleb had been on the water his whole life. His father had taught him to fish, and his grandfather before that, each generation wrestling with the merciless ocean for survival. Eli's mother had died in childbirth, leaving Caleb to raise the boy alone. Every storm, every haul, every aching hour spent at sea was for his son. The boat pitched violently over a massive wave, nearly capsizing before slamming back down. Caleb cursed under his breath, but his voice died in his throat when lightning split the sky, illuminating something vast beneath the surface. A shadow, massive and shifting, moved with an unnatural rhythm. Tentacles uncoiled like smoke, too slow and deliberate to be anything natural. Eli's grip on the railing tightened, his knuckles white. He turned toward his father, his eyes wide, silently begging for reassurance Caleb couldn't give. The storm abruptly fell silent. The rain stopped midair, the wind vanished, and the ocean stilled to a glassy surface. The water in front of the boat began to churn and rise. Caleb staggered back as something emerged from the depths, towering over the fishing boat. It was monstrous, its form an affront to nature. Shifting masses of writhing tentacles tipped with glowing orbs that pulsed faintly, casting the deck in a cold, otherworldly light. Its massive body glistened as though carved from wet obsidian, and at its center loomed a gaping maw filled with countless jagged teeth. But it was the eyes that stopped Caleb. Two immense glowing orbs fixed on him, unblinking and ancient. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His breath caught in his chest, and he sank to his knees, trembling under the weight of its gaze. The voice came not from the creature's mouth, but from the very air around them, vibrating deep in their bones.
You seek the bounty of the sea. She withholds from you. I shall provide. I will grant all that you desire and more. You need only listen for my summons and carry what I ask to the shore.
Eli turned to his father, his body trembling as the creature's voice reverberated in the air. His eyes, wide with fear, locked onto Caleb, silently pleading. Caleb looked back at his son, but his expression was distant, unreadable, as though he were already lost in the creature's grasp.
Your first cargo is already aboard. Do not disturb it. And when you reach your destination, do not look upon it.
The voice added, its tone a quiet command, heavy with inevitability. The creature's tentacles writhed in the air as its glowing eyes bored into Caleb.
The water demands a binding. Spill a drop of the boy's blood into the sea. Only then will the pact hold.
Eli flinched, looking at Caleb with wide, tear-filled eyes. Caleb's hand trembled as he drew his fishing knife. His voice was barely a whisper as he said,
"It's just a little cut, Eli. Don't move."
He pricked his son's finger, and a single drop of blood fell into the water. The sea rippled unnaturally as the creature seemed to shudder with satisfaction.
Return whenever the storm calls. The sea rewards those who obey.
The creature sank back into the depths, leaving Caleb standing frozen on the deck, his son watching him with wide, haunted eyes. The storm had passed, leaving the ocean eerily calm as Caleb steered the boat north of the harbour, toward a secluded cove as commanded by the creature. The cove was infamous among fishermen for its treacherous rocks and unpredictable tides, a place Caleb had avoided his entire career. Tonight, however, it felt as though the boat was being drawn there by unseen hands, the path illuminated by the faint glow of the moon filtering through heavy clouds. Eli sat on a bench near the bow, his knees pulled to his chest. He hadn't spoken since the encounter, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the horizon. Caleb felt the weight of his silence, but didn't dare speak himself. As they approached the cove, the jagged cliffs rose like silent sentinels on either side, their edges sharp and glinting faintly in the moonlight. The boat slowed as Caleb eased off the throttle, letting it drift toward the shallows. The water lapped gently against the hull, a stark contrast to the turmoil within Caleb's mind. "Do not look upon it," the creature's voice had commanded, but the temptation clawed at him. What was in the hold? What had he agreed to ferry? They would anchor just off the shoreline. Caleb and Eli kept their gaze fixed ahead, careful not to look below deck. A slithering sound filled the air, wet, deliberate and unnatural. Caleb's chest tightened, but he forced himself to focus on the ropes in his hands. Beside him, Eli's breath hitched.
"Dad,"
he whispered, his voice trembling.
Don't look, Eli.
Caleb said, his tone pleading now. But Eli couldn't stop himself. As the slithering sound grew louder, he turned, his gaze drawn to the hold. The hatch creaked open, and a shape began to emerge, dark and slick. The thing turned toward Eli, though it had no discernible eyes, and he felt its presence pierce into his mind. A voice, cold and sharp, whispered directly into his thoughts.
"You should do as you're told, boy."
Eli stumbled back, clutching his head. Caleb saw him and grabbed his arm, shaking him.
What did you do? Did you look?
Eli shook his head quickly, his lips trembling.
"No, I didn't see anything."
Caleb's stomach churned, but he didn't push further. He turned back toward the water as the slithering sound faded. Whatever it was had left the boat and disappeared into the shadows of the shore. They sat in silence for a long moment before Caleb spoke again.
Let's go home.
Eli didn't respond. His hands were shaking, his breath shallow. Caleb said nothing more as he turned the boat around, steering them back toward the harbour. A few weeks had passed since Caleb's first trip to the cove. The hauls had been miraculous, his nets returning each morning brimming with fish that shimmered with unnatural colours, their scales reflecting hues he'd never seen before. The town had taken notice, praising Caleb for his sudden fortune. For the first time in years, his debts were shrinking, and the anxiety that had gnawed at him for so long began to ease. But the weight of what he had done lingered, and Caleb found himself at the town's pub one evening, seeking solace in the amber warmth of whiskey. The room buzzed with muted conversation and the clink of glasses. The bartender, Charlie, a man Caleb had known since childhood, leaned on the counter, pouring Caleb another drink.
"Business must be good,"
Charlie said, his voice flat but pointed. Caleb nodded politely, lifting the glass to his lips. Charlie lingered, his gaze sharp.
"Pretty lucky for a humble ferryman."
Caleb froze, the glass halfway to his mouth. He lowered it slowly, searching Charlie's face for meaning. Charlie smiled faintly, but his eyes were dark. Before Caleb could respond, Charlie turned and moved down the bar, tending to another customer. Caleb sat in silence, the bartender's words echoing in his head. The unease gnawed at him, and Caleb left the bar earlier than usual. But he didn't go home. Instead, he lingered in the shadows near the pub, watching as Charlie locked up for the night. The bartender whistled a low tune as he stepped out into the rain. his hat pulled low over his face. Caleb followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. Charlie moved with purpose, heading toward the harbor, then veering off onto the narrow path leading to the cove north of the town. Caleb's heart pounded as he followed, his boots slipping on the slick rocks. The cove was eerily quiet, the sound of the waves muffled as if the world itself were holding its breath. Charlie stopped at the edge of the water, his silhouette outlined faintly by the moonlight. Caleb crouched behind a cluster of rocks, his breath shallow as he watched. For a moment, Charlie stood motionless, staring out at the water. Then, without warning, he began to change. His body twisted and contorted, his limbs elongating unnaturally. His skin seemed to ripple and shimmer as it split apart, revealing something slick and alien beneath. The man Caleb had known his entire life melted away, replaced by a creature that slithered toward the water. Caleb's stomach churned as the thing slipped into the waves, disappearing beneath the surface. He stayed frozen in place, unable to move or breathe, until the ripples in the water faded and the cove was silent once more. The storms became Caleb's signal, a silent summons from the creature beneath the waves. On those nights, he would wake Eli, and the two would board the boat. Each trip followed the same grim routine. The hatch would thrum with an unnatural presence, the hold filled with something grotesque and unknowable. Caleb kept his eyes forward as he ferried the cargo to the cove, never daring to look below deck. At sea, the boat would rock gently in the shallow water as the creature's voice slithered into Caleb's mind. The bond must be fed, it would say. The blade felt heavier in Caleb's hand with each trip, his fingers trembling as he pricked Eli's finger. A single drop of blood would fall into the sea, causing the water to ripple and glow. Eli no longer flinched. At first, he had pleaded with his father, his eyes wide with betrayal. But over time, the boy's fear was replaced with something colder. His gaze would linger on the water after the ritual, his expression distant and unreadable. Caleb tried to avoid looking at him during those moments, afraid of what he might see in his son's eyes. Each time Caleb saw the drop of blood welling from Eli's finger, a sharp pang of guilt tore through his chest, as if the knife had pricked his soul instead. The trips were always followed by abundance. Caleb's fleet returned to the harbor brimming with fish that shimmered like jewels. The townsfolk marveled at the bounty, their envy turning to awe as Caleb's wealth grew. The once struggling fisherman became the town's savior, a man whose name was spoken with reverence. He bought newer, larger boats and expanded his fleet. Soon, Caleb owned the fish market, several restaurants, and even an inn. But as Caleb's influence in the town grew, so did his unease. Eli, once full of curiosity and light, grew cold and withdrawn. The boy, now a young man, carried himself with an air of quiet authority that unnerved Caleb. On the nights of the storms, Eli no longer needed to be woken. He would stand at the dock before Caleb even called for him, staring out at the churning sea as though answering a call only he could hear. One stormy night, as Caleb lit the lantern on the boat, Eli spoke without turning around.
They're happy with us.
Caleb's stomach churned.
What are you talking about?
Eli's lips curled into a faint smile.
You've heard them too, haven't you? In your dreams?
Caleb's breath caught. He had been having dreams, dark, twisted visions of the cove, of the creatures he ferried. He had dismissed them as nightmares, the product of guilt and fear.
I don't dream.
Eli said, as though reading his father's thoughts.
They show me things you wouldn't understand.
Caleb stared at his son, the lantern light flickering between them. Eli's eyes seemed to shimmer faintly, reflecting the glow of the sea. The boy no longer followed Caleb's lead. Instead, he moved with purpose, guiding the blood rituals and directing their trips. On the nights when Caleb hesitated, Eli would give him a look, calm, sharp, and unyielding, that left no room for argument. Through it all, Eli grew more distant. The children in the town followed him like moss to a flame, their eyes wide and blank as they hung on his every word. Caleb often saw them gathered at the docks late at night, staring out at the dark water. When he confronted Eli about it, the boy dismissed his concerns with a calmness that sent chills down Caleb's spine.
They just want to see the truth,
Eli said one evening, as Caleb stood on the dock with him.
What truth?
Caleb asked, his voice trembling. Eli smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon.
You will see.
Eli's influence spread through the town. The children became quiet and detached, their once bright eyes dulled by some unseen weight. Caleb would start to notice the same all-knowing smile that Charlie gave him show up on the faces of the townsfolk more and more. As Caleb passed the fish market one morning, he caught snippets of conversation.
It watched me last night, from the water.
One vendor whispered, her hands trembling as she gutted a fish. Another voice murmured from the shadows of the dock.
Sometimes I swear I hear the waves speaking my name.
One night, after another successful haul, Caleb found Eli sitting in the kitchen, staring into the darkness.
They're waiting.
Eli said softly. Caleb hesitated, his chest tightening.
Who's waiting?
Eli turned to him, his faint smile returning.
You'll see soon enough.
The storm raged with a fury Caleb hadn't seen in years. Waves crashed against the harbor, and the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows of Caleb's home. He knew what it meant. The call had come again. Eli was already waiting by the door, his coat on and lantern in hand. His eyes, though, were what unsettled Caleb most, reflecting the faint, unnatural glow of the sea, even in the dim light of the room.
You ready?
Caleb said flatly, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. Eli nodded, his faint smile unwavering.
It's time.
The walk to the boat was silent, save for the howling wind and the crash of rain against their backs. Caleb's hands trembled as he lit the lantern and climbed aboard. The boat groaned under the weight of the storm, the deck slick and treacherous. Eli stood at the bow, staring out at the roiling waves with quiet determination. When they reached the open ocean, the water stilled, and the creature rose. Its massive form towered over the boat, the glowing orbs of its eyes piercing through the storm's darkness. The voice came, low and resonant, vibrating in Caleb's bones.
The time has come. You have prospered. The land has prospered. Now, the bond must be sealed.
Caleb's throat tightened.
What do you mean?
He asked, though he already knew. The creature's voice was steady, unyielding.
The boy, give him to the sea, or all will be taken. Your fleet, your fortune, your town, all will sink beneath the waves.
Caleb's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles white.
No, you can't have him.
Eli turned to him, his expression calm, almost serene.
It's okay, Dad.
What?
Caleb's voice cracked as he stared at his son. Eli stepped closer, his gaze steady.
This is what I was meant for. I've known for a long time.
No,
Caleb said, shaking his head,
I can't.
You must.
his tone soft but firm.
This is what they've been preparing me for. This is why they've been speaking to me. Why they've shown me everything. It's not just for them, Dad. It's for us.
Tears blurred Caleb's vision.
You're my son. I can't.
You have to. We must complete the bond.
The creature loomed closer, its glowing eyes burning into Caleb's soul.
Choose.
Caleb sank to his knees, the weight of the choice crushing him. He looked at Eli, his son, his flesh and blood, who now stood before him as something unrecognizable. Eli's face was calm, almost eager, as though he welcomed what was coming. With trembling hands, Caleb reached for the lantern. His breath hitched as he turned it down, casting the boat into shadow.
I'm sorry.
He whispered, though he wasn't sure if the words were meant for Eli or himself. Eli stepped toward the edge of the boat, the storm whipping around him. He turned back to Caleb one last time, his faint smile unwavering.
It's okay, Dad. I'll see you soon.
And then he stepped off. The water didn't swallow him. It welcomed him. The waves parted as Eli descended, his body shimmering faintly as he was consumed by the depths. For a moment, the storm fell silent. Caleb stood frozen, the lantern clutched in his hands, staring at the spot where his son had disappeared. The creature's voice returned.
The bond is sealed. You are one with the tide. The land is mine.
Caleb felt the boat lurch beneath him, and he stumbled back, gripping the wheel for support. The ocean rippled with an unnatural light as though the water was alive. When Caleb returned to the harbor, it was unrecognizable. The town was no longer a place of life, but of shadows. The people he had known were gone, replaced by shapes that moved in the dark, their forms slick and twisted. The streets were silent, save for the faint hum of the ocean, which now seemed to pulse through every corner of the town. Caleb knew he could never leave. The creature's voice echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of his purpose. He would ferry its kind for eternity, guiding them to the shore as the land was slowly consumed. And so Caleb ferried on, a shadow adrift on a sea of regret, as the land he once knew dissolved into the deep, swallowed whole by the promises of the tide. Thank you for watching The Abysmal Signal. We upload dark, twisted, and mysterious videos weekly. Please like and subscribe, and click the bell icon to stay notified about our latest explorations into the unknown. Until we meet again, remember, what lies beyond the veil may be closer than you think.